G'day, everyone, and welcome back to the broadcast where I attempt to give listeners some insights into the life of a politician. Today, I'll talk about how to make big changes in politics with my special guest, former Senator Nick Sherry. G'day, Nick.
Hi, and hi to your listeners and viewers.
Thanks, Nick, and it's really good to have him on board. I'm Shane Broad, a Labor MP in the Tasmanian State Parliament. And just before we get into the conversation, I'll just introduce you to former Senator Nick Sherry. Now, Nick Sherry was first elected in the Australian Senate as a Labor Party senator in 1990, and he resigned in 2012, so 22 years in politics. So that's actually quite a long run there, Nick.
Yes, it's a long innings, to use the cricket terminology, more than most, but an exciting and interesting period.
So maybe before we get into that whole thing around how to get big stuff done, maybe if we can talk about your early career before you got into politics as a senator.
Sure. Well, look, I was studying at university, and my first job was night shift cashier auditor at Rest Point Hotel Casino, which is in Hobart. So I was there for 4 years. And then I became secretary of a union called the Liquor and Allied Trades. Think about sherry and think about liquor. The name suited very, very well. And I did that role for 10 years. Now, that was my first introduction to superannuation. And it was in the Hawke Keating period when there was an accord negotiated in 1983 when Labor took government. And part of the accord was, because of high inflation, a modest wage increase, but also the introduction of superannuation for those Australians who did not have it, which was 7 out of 10 Australians. And that accord, Mark 1, occurred in the mid 1980s, and that's when compulsory superannuation was introduced. And I was still with the old liquor trade union, and of course, hotel workers, truckies, retail workers, 7 out of 10 had no superannuation. So I was responsible for assisting the introduction of initially 3% superannuation into the hospitality industry. I was asked to be a trustee of a fund called Host Plus, which today is, about 120 billion. So I was a founding trustee back in 1987 for that first 3%. And it didn't just apply to full-time workers, it applied to casual and part-time workers. And of course, the hospitality has the majority of the workforce. Superannuation then was seen as a privilege, not a right. If you were a worker, low middle income, you got the age pension and nothing more. If you were well paid in the finance sector or management or the public sector, you got superannuation on top of your age pension then. So you were very well off in those sort of roles. So it was a very important policy. And that happened, Accord Mark 1, before I was elected to the Senate in 19.
So, I mean, superannuation is a massive change. I know that it came in a fair while ago now, and people may take it for granted, but back when you first started, it was only really bank managers and public servants that had access to superannuation. So what were the working people thinking about superannuation when it first came in?
Well, for that 7 out of 10, they didn't know much about it because they didn't have it. They knew that, public servants and executives, managers, etc., got this extra, but all we get, low middle income earners, was the age pension. So the Accord, and this was one of the two major reforms of the Hawke Keating government during that period, superannuation for all, and of course Medicare. And I had to go around to meet with hotel, restaurant, club workers, explain about Host Plus because I was a founding trustee. It was my introduction to the system. And it was an exciting time because you felt very positive about improving the lives of working people. And there was a lot of interest. But you're right, today people take it for granted. But at that time, it was strongly opposed by employers, by the banks, by the then Liberal opposition under John Howard. They didn't want to see workers get superannuation. So it was a really important positive policy. It was very, very critical because today, fast forward, those workers, if they're approaching retirement in their 60s, they'll have on average a couple of $100,000. So if it hadn't been for what happened back in the late 1980s, that was the start. War came later. That was the start. They would have nothing. They would have nothing.
So you fast forward a little bit, a couple of years. So in 1990, when you became a senator, um, straight back into superannuation. Is that right? That was seen to be.
Yes, yes. I mean, I was a senator, and it was an exciting time because Hawke and Keating wanted to increase the level of contributions from 3 to 9%. And secondly, they wanted a regulatory regime to apply. And they approached me and said, would I chair the Senate Committee on Superannuation? And in 1990, then in 1992, what happened was um, Hawke and Keating announced the 3 was going to go to 9. The Labor Party determined it wanted to go from 3 to 9 over 10 years.
That's percent, that is.
Percentage,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. So from 3% to 9%. And the Labor Party and the Labor parliamentarians, including myself, supported that. We had laws which we introduced into Parliament. I was in the Senate. Labor didn't have a majority. And I chaired the committee that did all of the public hearings. They went on for months and a lot of opposition, a lot of opposition.
So, I mean, as you've said, there was a lot of pushback,
Yeah,
obviously from banks, from business, and also the opposition at the time, being the
yeah.
Liberal National Party. So, what sort of other barriers did you face that you had to work through to get this the increase from a 3% contribution of your wage to a 9%?
Well, as I said, Labor didn't have a majority in the Senate. So you had a lot of powerful forces, the banks, the Liberal Party, and others opposing this. And so the committee hearings were important because we had to convince the public of the importance of this additional superannuation, of the change. I had to convince others in the Senate um, because we needed their votes outside the Labor Party. We needed their votes. And so this was a process that went on for many months. That wasn't my only role in the Senate, but it was my most important and largest role.
So we've had a lot of support. So what was the support like within the Labor Party, for example? So
Oh,
it goes back to the Accord of
yes, yes,
83 and then the
yeah,
second Accord. And then we had a transition to Paul Keating
yeah,
as Prime Minister. So
yeah.
what changed with that?
It was seen as a basic fairness. It was the old system was unfair. 7 out of 10 Australian workers, the lowest paid, got nothing, and the higher paid, generally with more secure jobs, got a lot more, plus the age pension. So it was an unfair system. And I think this was important to myself and Labor colleagues because it represented Labor values, improving the lives of low middle income workers. Very important, together with Medicare.
So then we had the election that Paul Keating lost, and then John Howard became Prime Minister. And what happened then? So there was some resistance from the Liberals while trying to have this debate.
Yeah.
What happened when they actually got the keys to the kingdom?
Well, they wanted to stop it, get rid of it all. That was too difficult for them because it had become very popular because workers wanted they were getting a yearly account which showed how much money they were accruing in the system. But what did happen is that it was intended there be a government contribution in addition to the employer contribution, and the Liberal Party was successful in stopping that. So the contribution, percentage contribution, which Labor had put into law, did get to 9% by 2002. But the Liberals stopped anything more.
And then we can, I suppose, fast forward a little bit more. And then after the Kevin '07 election, so 2017, you were actually appointed the first ever Minister for Superannuation and Corporate Law.
Yes.
So that's a big change. Obviously,
Yeah.
it shows that the Kevin Rudd government obviously thought that superannuation was a big issue. So they appointed you as the first ever Minister for Superannuation. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, effectively, superannuation by then had grown. It was a large part of retirement, for some more than the age pension. And it was a big economic system, big investor in the Australian economy and makes an important contribution. So Kevin took a view, Kevin Rudd, and the caucus, that we should have a specialist minister, and I was fortunate to take on that role. And then there were two things we did. We did introduce legislation for another 3% to take it to 12%. Um, and it only reached 12%. It was supposed to get there 6 or 7 years ago, but the Liberals, as usual, they got back into government and they stopped it. And then when Labor was re-elected 4 years ago under Anthony Albanese, we got the last 3%, taking it to 12% on July 1 this year.
So you came in as the Minister for Superannuation under the Kevin '07, so 2007, but then obviously you couldn't really get cracking on superannuation because of the global financial crisis. So
Yes.
you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, look, briefly, I mean, we came into government and the world was, looking pretty good. There was, good economic growth. Unemployment was low. All of a sudden, banks start collapsing all around the world, except Australia. And there was a crisis because the world was moving into recession, unemployment was increasing. And many of the banks had collapsed. And you can't have an economy without banks. So it wasn't just a recession. We looked like there was going to be a depression. And my father lived through the Great Depression, and I remember the terrible stories. We could have seen, and I mean, unemployment is close to zero now. Unemployment could have reached 20%. 1 in 5. It would have been terrible, terrible.
Yeah, so pretty desperate times.
Oh, quite extraordinary. So we had to take decisions we never dreamed of in our lives. So with my responsibilities, for example, there was a lot of speculation about the value of a business on the stock exchange. And this speculation could lead to the collapse of a business. And one of them was Macquarie Bank.
So
And
you're talking specifically here about short selling. So
yeah,
people would
short selling.
speculate that um, a, something like Macquarie Bank was going to collapse,
Yeah.
and so they'd set a position to short
Yeah.
sell, and then maybe create a rumor that it
Yes.
was about to go under, and then make a profit out of that.
That's right. I mean, you can make a profit from shares going down, not just up. So I had to prohibit that. I had to ban it. I would never have dreamed of that sort of decision a year earlier. And there were other decisions, guarantees to the banks. And look, I think Rudd, to his credit, Kevin Rudd, and people, some people criticise Kevin Rudd, but he, myself, and Treasurer and Finance Minister, we were an economic group meeting every few days outside formal government to make these sort of decisions. And Australia didn't have a recession. Kevin Rudd's leadership in that period made a big. Australia was virtually, I think there was one other country that didn't have a recession. There were no bank collapses, and we had a slow recovery.
So that's one of the funny things in politics is the disaster averted. You
Yes,
don't get credit for averting the disaster. And
yes,
Australia sailed on through. There wasn't a
yes,
recession, and economic growth continued for like
correct.
20 years straight.
Well, it's continued. I think we've had the longest period of economic growth without a recession of any advanced economy in the world.
It's incredible. And I suppose, can you argue that superannuation has a part in that because of the massive pool of investment in the country?
Absolutely. I mean, superannuation's for retirement, so it's a social policy, but all that savings has helped drive economic growth because the savings is invested in Australian.
And then we get to the period, I suppose, when we had a bit of turmoil in the Labor Party. But
Yes.
so in 2012, when you were actually having your, oh no, 2012, when you had your 20-year anniversary, that was actually the dinner that night turned out to be quite eventful.
Yes, it was actually 2010. 20 years, and Kevin Rudd was speaking. And of course, that was the night when a challenge was launched, and he was removed as Prime Minister the next day. I voted for Kevin, as I'd voted for Bob Hawke earlier. I always took a view that, the leaders, sometimes they do make poor decisions, but the leaders who take us into government deserve loyalty. Shortly after that, I decided, I'd been in politics for 22 years. That's a very good run. It would be time for.
It must have been a bit weird. Kevin Rudd's there giving a speech praising you up, and then suddenly everyone's phone
Oh,
starts pinging.
yes, and of course, to his credit, he finished his speech. He didn't walk out because he had to talk to his colleagues. Everyone, it was quite weird because there were 100 people in the room, and within 5 minutes, there were about 10 or 15, and they weren't politicians. Everyone left the room. Anyway, yeah, so, but I decided, a few months after that, it was time to retire. Uh, 22 years.
So, I mean, when you look back, something like superannuation, it has been a massive change for Australia even.
Yeah.
How do you look back on that, thinking that that you had a significant part in what was a major change against the odds at some time, at some stages?
Yeah, look, some personal satisfaction that I've made a contribution alongside people like Hawke and Keating and a guy called Bill Kelty from the union movement. I made a contribution to what I think has improved the lives of working. And uh, you know, um, there are other things you do in politics, but that was my major focus, and very glad to have been involved since I've retired from politics in 2012. I've been chair of a superannuation fund for the last 3 years, and I've been, giving advice to other countries about superannuation, pensions. So I'm very fortunate, and really to have in your life a significant policy issue where you've made a difference. I'm modest about my contribution. That's important to me personally, but even more important, it's improved the lives of people.
So you talk about how you provide advice to other countries. So what do they think when they look at
Oh,
Australia's system and like, do they go, "Oh my God, how do we get that?" Or "I want that one," or what do
well,
they say?
countries have different, cultures and economies and existing pension systems, but there's a lot of interest in Australia. They ask about the governance, how it's invested, because we have arm's length. The government doesn't interfere or direct investment. So they're very interested in how the system was introduced and why the fairness, fundamental fairness, how it's regulated, how it's invested. So I give, I'm off to London in a couple of weeks to speak at a conference about all of these issues, and I've done that once or twice a year overseas. Some countries like Colombia, Ireland, the UK, South Africa. That's interesting and rewarding.
Yeah, and obviously you've got a fair bit of expertise on the nitty gritty of the details of how
Yes.
to set up superannuation funds and the
Yeah,
like.
you can have the big picture vision, and certainly Keating and Hawke and Bill Kelty had that. I had to get down into much more of the detail, and there's a huge amount of detail in policy change.
So superannuation still remains very important. Typically, the majority of people only really think about super as they're getting towards retirement. But obviously, it's still pretty a massive investment. But there are risks, aren't there? And
Yes, yeah. Look, there are, but on investment risk, the law requires the money to be diversified. So it's invested across different shares in property, in infrastructure, and cash and bonds. So it's diversified. But markets can go down. Um, but 1 year in 7 can be negative. In other words, your saving can, but 6 years out of 7 are positive. And roughly, and people are astounded by this, every 10 years your money should double. So $1 today in 10 years will be worth $2. In 20 years it'll be worth $4 because it keeps doubling. That's what history shows us.
and I suppose we can't. We probably should mention that there are some people who take advantage of the superannuation system in a
Yes.
bad way. If you just want to briefly touch on
Yeah,
that.
look, briefly, there have been a couple of cases in the media in Tasmania. They're part of a national scandal where people were convinced, 10,000 people were convinced to leave regulated funds that are well regulated and move over. And frankly, I think they were misled to move out of well regulated funds. And sadly, um, the investments appear either some of it to have been stolen or poorly invested, not sufficient diversification, and a lot of money's been lost, and so that's going through the courts at the moment. I think most will get the majority of their money back, but it's a bad example of bad behaviour.
So what you actually mean there is getting people to shift from a regulated super fund into a self-managed super fund.
In some cases, self-managed. In other cases, um, it the investment option, if you like, wasn't diversified. So there was too much in property, too speculative. And one of the important lessons in investment in pensions for retirement or superannuation, you must have diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Maybe that's a topic that we can come back to
Yes.
at some other stage. But
Yeah.
obviously, you've had a bit of an impact because you were appointed an officer of the Order of Australia earlier this year, and congratulations on that. Hang on. Well done, Nick. So
Yeah, well, thank you. As I said, look, it's a pleasure to have made some difference to people's lives. That's the important thing.
yeah, anyway, so we'll probably wrap up there. Thanks for
Thank you.
coming in, Nick, and hopefully we can get you back in to talk about some other topics.
Yes.
But in the meantime, if you like this sort of content, I'd ask you to like and subscribe to the broadcast so that we can keep getting great people in like Nick. But until next time, that's goodbye from me. Thanks very much for listening to the broadcast, and thanks, Nick.
Thanks.